Hello everyone, my name is AJ and welcome to the first lesson for the CSSG education team. Today I'm going to be talking about HTML and CSS and really set the foundation for a lot of what we're going to be doing in the education team together. Now, according to the survey, a good amount of you have even some basic familiarity with HTML and CSS. However, I'm going to be going over the basics of it so you can get a little bit of a review on these particular topics. All right, so the first thing I'm going to be talking about here is going to be the anatomy of a website or a web application, right? Because there are three main components. First, you have the structure of a website, right? Like what is actually on the website? What elements do you physically see when you load up a website? So for example, let's say I have a website here that looks kind of like this, right? Well, you might have some sort of title here. You might also have some sort of image that you see on the website, right? Then you might see some text, right? Some paragraphs, you might see a bulleted list, you might see a table, etc. Well, all of these are individual elements which go on a web page, right? You might have a title, all right? You might have an image, you might have paragraphs, you might have lists, and you might even have many other things, such as links, such as tables. There are all these different types of elements that we can have on our website, okay? And we specify what elements a website has by using HTML, okay? HTML is the main kind of programming language or mainly text that we use to specify the structure of a website. Secondly, we often have to worry about the style of a website, right? How a website actually looks. Because you can have a bunch of elements on your web page, but you want to style it in some way so people, actually want to visit your website and use your website. It needs to be, appealing, and it needs to be simple enough for many people to use. And we can specify the style of a website, how each of these elements actually look using CSS. And then the last component of a website is the function of a website. And what actually happens when you use the website? What happens when you click a button or you interact with all these different elements? That is controlled with the programming language JavaScript. All right, so it is controlled with JavaScript. And JavaScript is a programming language that we are really going to be diving deep into as kind of part of the CSSG education team, because we build all of our web apps using the JavaScript programming language and also using HTML and CSS to structure and style our web pages. Okay, so now I'm going to be kind of jumping into HTML. So HTML is a language which, if you've coded in something like Python or Java before, you're often used to kind of this basic syntax. Well, HTML has a syntax as well. And remember, the purpose of HTML is to specify the elements on a website, right? So you have a bunch of elements that you want to somehow represent in HTML. And we can do this using this system that HTML has called tags, okay? And when you open an HTML document, you'll see a lot of these things where you have these you'll have an open and closed kind of angled bracket. You'll have a bunch of stuff in between. Then you'll have another one with the slash, and then you'll have a bunch of stuff in between those two structures, okay? And so an HTML tag is basically that. You have what's known as an opening tag, okay? So an opening tag would be right here. And then you have a closing tag. So your closing tag would be right here, okay? Now, what are tags? Well, tags are essentially the bounds for elements, okay? What does that mean? Well, if you have an element that you want to represent in HTML, you will have an opening tag, which basically tells the browser when you're opening this website that this is the start of an element. So this is going to be your opening tag, right? And you're basically saying, or the browser will look at this and say, okay, this is where an element starts, right? And then you'll have a closing tag at the end. And the closing tag will tell the browser that the element is finished, right? That everything that goes inside of this element finishes at the closing tag, right? So you'll have an opening tag, right? So you'll have an opening tag, and then you'll have a closing tag, and this together, all of this represents a single HTML element. And everything in between these two tags, right? Everything between these two tags represents the contents of the element. The contents of the element. All right. Now, how are these tags actually structured? Well, what you have is you have an opening. For your opening tag, you have this open and close angled bracket. All right. And then what you'll have next to it is you'll have some sort of text. And this text, which, kind of goes directly after that opening angled bracket, this specifies the type of element, right? This specifies the type of element. In this case, we put H1 in this tag, and H1 stands for a heading. So H1, this is going to be a header, and it's going to specifically be the first header, which means that it is the largest one. So you have H1, H2, H3, and basically these are headers that decrease in size as you increase the number, okay? You also have many other types of elements. You have, for example, P. P is simply a paragraph, right? You may have IMG, which stands for image. You might have a list, which is LI. Remember, these are all elements that I talked about kind of in the previous slide here. There are all specific tags. So for example, H1, image, for paragraphs, you might have P, and then your list, you'll actually have either UL or OL, which is a unordered list versus ordered list. We'll be talking about that later, don't worry. Right? So there, in this spot in our opening tag contains the element type, okay? And then in your closing tag, you also want to have the element type, right? Because when you have H2, or when you have all these elements, and you have all these various types of elements, you might have H1s, you might have paragraphs, you might have images, you need to be very specific about what you're actually closing, what element ends in your code. Because you may have an element, in here, for example, and you need to specify where it closes, and the browser needs to not get confused with all the different types of elements. So by specifying that this is an H1, it knows that, okay, well, it saw an opening H1 tag, this is the closing H1 tag, and so now this together defines an H1 element, all right? Now, a very important thing is that you must include a backslash in your closing tag. That, again, differentiates an opening tag and a closing tag for the browser, okay? And now, in your opening tag, on the opening tag, which is the left-hand side, next to the type of element, you might have what are known as arguments, right? So this here, for example, this is an argument. And arguments are basically parameters that specify more information about an element, okay? If you've used a programming language like Java or Python, this is very similar to a function call where you're simply, you have all these parameters that you're inputting to a function. Let's say I have a random function that is called, print. Actually, I can just use print. This is a Python function, print. In the parentheses, you would put the item to print, right? And this is a parameter for the function, for the print function. Putting your arguments inside of opening tags, this is very similar to these, these arguments or these parameters that you're inputting into a function. In this case, I'm using ID, and I'm basically specifying that the ID or a specific property of this H1 element is going to, in this case, equal main. The ID is going to equal main. And I'll be going into various arguments a little bit later. And then again, in between, just like I talked about over here, in between the two tags are the contents of the element. So everything in between the opening tag and the closing tag here, this is all the content of the element. So in this case, I have an opening H1 tag and I have a closing H1 tag. So this is going to be all together a header one element. And then in between the opening and closing tag, I have the content, which in this case is just text. All right. And again, together, I'm going to just write it out even here. So at the bottom, all of this together from the opening to the closing, right? So your opening tag to your closing tag, this is an H1 element. All right. So now I can continue this on and actually show you something else. So we're going to kind of dissect this a little bit. You see that we have an opening tag for this thing called a div, right? We don't really know what a div is yet, but we have this opening tag right here, and then you have a closing tag. So what are some things that you know about this? Well, you know that the element that is being specified here is a div, right? This is a div element. Now we don't know what it is, right? We don't know what div means, but this is a div element. And everything inside of the div element, right, are the contents of the div. And then here we have two paragraph, right, because these are P objects, and we know that P is a paragraph, or basically just text, right? So we have two paragraphs inside of this div element, and the first one, if you remember that this here is the opening, right? This here is the opening tag, and this is the closing tag. So the actual content inside of the first paragraph is the text that says paragraph 1. So we know that the first paragraph has the text paragraph 1 in it. And that you can do the same thing for the second paragraph. The second paragraph has paragraph 2 as its text. Now, another thing you can notice is that inside of our div, right, we did not include, well, not the bottom tag, the closing tag does not include arguments, but you can see that our div does not actually have any arguments, but our two paragraphs do. We have a class and we have a ID. Sorry, I think I may have said element. I'm talking about arguments here, right? Div does not have any arguments, but there are two paragraphs do. The first one is a class, and the second is an ID. Okay, these are both different arguments that you can include, and there are many, many arguments you can include, and there's a very large list of these, and you only really have to know a few, and you can always look up, on some sort of either table or online resource for HTML, all the various different arguments. But class and ID are very important. So class is basically a string, as you can see here. This is a string and this is a string that you can actually use to classify your elements. Okay, so oftentimes you'll have a bunch of p tags in your code, right? You'll have all these paragraphs. So you'll have all, like these are all p tags. However, you can have many p tags that now have this class argument and that you add in some text to. And now you have created kind of this, almost classification or this group of p elements. So for example, if you have your group of p tags, you then have within it, a group of test, right? A group of test p tags where all of them share the same class. And then you can also add ID, and ID is different than class because class is used often to group together or classify many elements together. However, ID is really reserved for only one element, meaning that every element should have a unique ID. You shouldn't be using the same ID for many elements. You only should be using an ID for one element. So for example, if my underscore para is an ID for this particular paragraph, it should really only be reserved for that one paragraph. I shouldn't be using the same ID for a different paragraph. All right? And we classify using tags and ID because oftentimes in our code, whether that be CSS or JavaScript, we might want to refer to our elements later, right? So we have here, we have kind of ID. So this is where class sits, right? Class, and then you have all. This kind of shows the relationship where you have all your p tags, then you might have a class which has a lot of p tags, but not all of them, right? Everything that has the same class. And then ID is really reserved for a single element. Now, why is this important? I'm going to get to that in a second with CSS, okay? Now, this is a sample HTML site, and I'm going to kind of break down the components here. The first thing that you see is this doc type, right? Doc type HTML. And this is basically telling the browser that your entire file is an HTML file. This is a must. You must include this when you are, creating your HTML document. You must include the first thing. Then you'll have an HTML element, which is always also the largest element. Everything that you put in your website should be within this HTML element. This is just the structure. So HTML you must include, right? This you must include the opening and the close. And everything in between the closing and opening HTML tag are as the content for our HTML element. All right? And then you often have two sections. You have your head. Actually, I'm going to change the color here. So you have the head, and the head element actually contains information that's not shown on your website, but it contains very useful information for the browser about your website. So for example, the title of the website, right? What shows up actually on the tab of your browser, right? You know, when you change your tabs, you have that little title that you still see. That is controlled by this tag. If you want to connect your website to any external resource, either external data or external font, you put it in the head because it kind of contains metadata and a bunch of other information about your website there. And then below you have the body, and this, in between these two tags, is where you put almost everything, all of the elements that are on your website. So all in all, this website only has, if you load it up, it'll only have a single paragraph that says hello world on it. And that's it. All right. But if you want to make your website, you would use the same structure where you have the doc type, then you have this HTML, right? You'd have, I can actually do this laser pointer here. This is an HTML, right? So you'd want your HTML object, and then you want a head and a body element inside of this HTML, right? And then your head will often contain a title and any useful information. And lastly, you will have a body, and the body contains all of the elements on your website. All right. And lastly, I'm going to very quickly jump into CSS. And CSS looks very different than HTML, okay? And how you use CSS really depends on how you actually want to style your website, but this is the basic syntax, okay? So if you want to select all of the elements, okay, then what you do is you'd simply write the tag, which in this case, if I want to select all my paragraphs and style all my paragraphs, I would write P, right? I actually don't believe here this slide is a little bit incorrect. There shouldn't be a dot here, so I'm going to try and erase it if I can. There we go. So I have P, and then I have this open and closing brace, okay? And then all the styles I want to add go in between these two. So if I want to style every single paragraph on my page, I would write P here to select all the paragraphs. Then I would have this open and closing brace. And then I would have all of my styles. So for example, one style that exists is text align, right? This aligns the text of your paragraph. And I can set this to center. Now, you'll be wondering, well, how do I know, there's so many different styles, how do I know which one to select? Well, actually, when you are writing this in your code editor, oftentimes it will help you autocomplete. However, there are also, like I said, even with the arguments for example, a paragraph, there are many online resources that kind of specify all of the different styles for different elements. And it's really, really useful to take a look at that because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of potential ways to style each of your elements, right? However, it is really dependent on how you want to style it, right? You might not need to use, for example, text align on every paragraph, but you might want to change the font or the font color and all of that. There are all these various styles, right, that you can use, but this is just the basic, I guess, syntax on how to actually add style, right? You have the style that you want to change right here. So you have the style you want to change right here. Then you have this colon. And then you have the actual style you want to apply, right? You have your text align, which is going to be the property that you're trying to change. And then you have next to the colon, you have the style you actually want to apply. And then every line ends with a semicolon, okay? Every line within these opening and closing brace ends with a semicolon. Now, if you want to select classes, remember, this is why when I go back to this example, classes and IDs become really important. Because, well, most of the time I don't want to style every single paragraph. I might want to style a few paragraphs that are kind of related to each other, and that's where it's really good to use classes, because remember, classes can have multiple elements within kind of that share the same class. All right? So what I can do is I can say dot, and then I write the name of my class. So you can see it's different because with normal tags, you just write the tag name, but when you want to specify a class, you add a dot and then the name of the class. And then just like before, you have opening, closing, braces, and then you write all of your elements or all of, I guess, the styles you want to add in between. And then for IDs, if you, let's say, want to change the style of only a single element, you can give that element an ID, and then you can refer to it in your CSS by using a pound symbol or a hashtag. And then you write my ID or whatever you gave, whatever ID you gave to the element, and then you can add styles like so, in between the opening and closing brace. All right. Now, this is a very good introduction to the syntax and the structure behind HTML and CSS. In the actual project, in the first project you do, you'll begin to use these basic syntaxes, right? And everything you learned in this video, and begin to actually apply it to building your very own website. And it's going to be super cool. There'll be a README file attached to the project, which will really help walk you through how to actually do this, because you know how to kind of create HTML tags, and you know how generally an HTML file is structured, right, with doc type and HTML and all that, and you know how CSS works. However, actually now putting this together and using the various elements and tags that exist, right, because there's a lot more than H1 and P tags and all of that, right? And also with styles, there are a lot more styles than text-align. So you'll be able to take these concepts and begin to actually apply it to a real world problem. All right, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the Slack or send me an email, and I'll make sure to answer as quickly as possible. See you all in the next video.